Hello, everyone. Welcome to Building Envelope Budget. I'm Dustin Davis, and today, for a walk again, I'm going to talk about technology and tech stacks. And I guess my history when it comes to programming, I feel like I'm getting pretty old in this industry now, and that might be evident by some of the things I say. So I'm going to go back to high school. I got on the internet for the first time my senior year, and I was fascinated with it. We only had a library on a few computers in or we had the internet on a few computers in the library, and that's where I'd go on in the mornings. At the time, the Braves were in the World Series. They won the World Series that year, so that was 1995. I graduated in '96. So I remember going in and reading about the game on the internet the day after, watching it. But I thought it was really cool, all the stuff you could do on there, and there was so much stuff that I wish I had access to. Um, so yeah, it was still pretty early, as far as like there were chat rooms that you could go to, but it's nothing like we have today where it was like real time. It was like you type a message, you post it, the page would refresh and you'd see your message. Then you'd wait a few seconds or minutes and refresh again and see if anybody responded. So that was kind of how even the best chat systems worked back then. I served a mission, 2-year mission in South Africa, came home and got into college. And really, I wanted to work with computers. In high school, I also did a lot of computer aided drafting. I was in a club called VICA, Vocational Industrial Clubs of America, where I did computer aided drafting and computer aided manufacturing. Really enjoyed that. I thought I wanted to be an architect, but then I met an architect on my mission, and he said, "Oh, it's great if you want to starve for the first 15 years of your life," which I didn't want to do. So I think that kind of persuaded me. Also, um, so my senior year, we went to Kansas City and competed in a computer-aided manufacturing competition, and we actually won. It was kind of funny. We really didn't. We were just going from vacation, had no anticipation of winning that, but they said we scored higher than all the college teams even. So, and when I heard that, you'd think that would make me even more excited to go into it, but I was kind of I don't know, disappointed, or I don't know, it made me reflect like, do I really want to do this for a living? Like, here we've just scored higher than everyone. We're talking to some other teams, they had kids that worked for companies that made Indy 500 car parts, and we'd make yo-yos for fundraisers and stuff like that. So I was kind of, it made me question what I wanted to do, and I'd rather build the computer the drafting software that does that rather than do the drafting. And so when I got home, I went into computer programming, computer science, and ended up switching to computer information systems just because it was less math and I could get through it quicker. But essentially, same thing. And got a job working for a healthcare company, and I kept switching. I got into QA where I was testing software while I was going to school, and uh, so I'll kind of go back a bit. So while I was in school, I was still really fascinated with the internet. None of my classes were really web development. It was still pretty new when I first started college. Um, and so it was a lot of C++, a lot of command line stuff, which was frustrating to me because all the stuff you'd see people sell online were like graphical user interfaces. Nobody bought command line tools. I would ask instructors, like, well, do we get to learn how to build actual applications that people can interact with in Windows? And they said, no, it's all command line. So I didn't know where I would actually learn that. But as web development progressed, I just continued to go down that path because I was fascinated with it. So every day after school, I would sit in the computer lab until they closed, and I would go through uh, webmonkey.com tutorials. I don't even know if that's a thing anymore, but I just learn about the different HTML elements, and I had a website on angelfire.com, one of those flashy old 90s websites where you just throw everything but the kitchen sink on there, and just to play around and learn HTML. Uh, then I worked for a healthcare company that provided opportunities for growth and learning. So they would bring in instructors on various topics, and they had a class on JavaScript. So that was kind of the first introduction to JavaScript. I took a week-long course at work to learn JavaScript. So then I would write, like I built a calculator in JavaScript on my browser just for fun. That's where I probably wrote my first budgeting app, was just in JavaScript, where I think I talked about it in my first post. But I quickly learned that JavaScript, you could only do stuff in the browser. And so I needed to learn how to do some stuff on the back end to modify the HTML dynamically, which is how things were done back then. So uh, my friend created a website for his high school. That was an alumni site where people would email him their updates, and he would modify the HTML and upload it to the website so people could kind of keep track of each other and what they were up to. And so I thought that was cool, and I wanted something like that. So I built one for my high school. Well, I wanted to, and the domain that I wanted to register was unionhigh.com. And sorry, I'm walking through Leeds right now. Hopefully it's not too noisy. So I reached out to the person who owned that domain because he just had a coming soon type page. He hadn't done anything with it yet, and he just happened to go to the same high school, which was lucky because there's lots of union high schools throughout the country. But he actually owned a web hosting company, or an internet provider company, which also did web hosting. And so he told me if I wanted to build the website, he'd give me the domain and he would host it for me. But his servers were Windows servers, so he said I would need to learn ASP. And so I learned ASP, which stands for Active Server Pages. It's Microsoft technology. Now they have ASP.NET. So this was pre.NET. This is like whatever, what it used to be, like version 6 or something before .NET. And I used Microsoft Access as the database behind it. Got it working. People could submit their updates and it would just show up automatically. I think I had a login to it. I can't even remember now. Pretty sure I did. But after maybe a year or two of him hosting that site, he messaged me and said he was shutting down his web hosting internet providing company. It wasn't working out. And yeah, basically gave me the domain and said you'll just have to find new hosting. And as I looked around, hosting for Microsoft, the cheapest I could find was like $20 a month, and I didn't really have the money to pay $20 a month for hosting back then for a site that I wasn't making any money on. So I started looking around at alternatives and found that I could get a lot cheaper Linux hosting. But with Linux, I would have to use MySQL and PHP as an alternative. So that's when I learned PHP and MySQL and basically rewrote the site. And it was, I mean, they were very similar, but I enjoyed working with PHP more. And the hosting was cheaper. So after that, it's like all the projects I did were in PHP. Fast forward a few years, I ended up getting a job finally after probably about 5 or 6 years doing QA as a developer, and worked for a small company. And I was now working on some PHP, but also Visual Basic, uh, Microsoft type stuff. But eventually I moved, once our main PHP guy left, it all fell on my lap, so I was maintaining that as well. And it was during that time that I learned about Django and Python. So I first learned about Ruby on Rails. It was kind of starting to make a lot of noise. Looking into that, started learning it. And there was these guys that would create videos. They're kind of parody of these Mac versus PC videos, if you've ever seen those in the past, where there were two guys and like, what? Hi, I'm a Mac and I'm a PC. The Mac guy was supposed to be cool and hip, and the PC guy was a little nerdy. But they did kind of a parody on that. It was like, hi, I'm Ruby on Rails, and I'm Cold Fusion, or I'm PHP, and they would just make fun of these other languages. And I thought it was funny. They were pretty true. They hit the nail on the head as far as I was concerned with PHP. But they did one video on comparing themselves to Django. They called it Da Django. And that one fascinated me because they said they couldn't really make fun of it. It's like, oh, we have this and we have this. It's like, yeah, so do we. And so I was intrigued by this other framework, Django. So I looked into that, and it actually made more sense to me. Where Ruby on Rails was model view controller, it didn't click in my brain, that concept. But Django was model view template, and sorry, someone was just briding me, and that made more sense to me. So that's kind of the path I went. I just enjoyed the community more. I got a lot of help online as I was learning, and I was learning Python to use Django. So that was kind of my difficulty. A lot of people knew Python and would learn Django as a web development as part of their Python skills, but I learned Python specifically just to do Django. So I didn't really know what was Python, what was Django. That makes sense. Um, but I liked it so much, I started looking for other full-time jobs that did Django. And looking all around the Salt Lake area, I found two companies, and both were in Salt Lake, and I was living down in Utah County. The first one I had an interview with, I canceled the interview because I just thought it was too far away. It was downtown Salt Lake. The other was in a little bit closer in West Valley, and that was Send Out Cards. And I applied to that, and I got that job. And I think that's where I really started developing skills. But as I was learning Django, um, this is kind of where I talked about my friend called me up and wanted to do some project, and that's when we started in Zolo. So yeah, that's kind of my history. So now, fast forward to where we are today. Um, I really like going to programming conferences, and one year I went to a Utah open source conference, and it seemed like a third of the talks that I went to were talking about this new JavaScript framework called Angular. I'm sure everyone's heard of Angular now, but it was new at the time. And back then I was using jQuery a lot for everything I did. And so I tried out Angular. Really liked it. We jumped in with both feet, and I started swapping out all my jQuery with Angular. And eventually things moved more to SPAs, or single page applications, where it was all done with JavaScript, which was kind of a crazy shift for me because when I first learned JavaScript, people would try to avoid JavaScript because it was so slow. But when Google came in and rewrote the JavaScript engine, called it V8, it was actually faster than Python. So, and running things with JavaScript in the browser became a lot faster. So that's kind of the reason things moved towards these single page applications. You just have everything running on the client and you make API calls to get the data you need. And so that's the direction I went. Went to the very first Angular JS. It was held in Salt Lake. And then I think they had one again the next year. And the next year, I think it was the second year they had it, they announced Angular 2, that they were going to completely rewrite Angular. And that kind of threw a wrench in the whole community because everybody had gotten behind Angular. And now it's like, well, now what do we use? And a lot of people moved to Ember. Other people moved to React. And we had a project at work that we were going to use Angular on. But once they announced that, we didn't want to use it because we didn't want to have to rewrite it once the new version came out. And they had a beta version out of Angular 2 that you could try out. And I really didn't like it. I don't like the syntax. It was just weird. Had all these weird syntax inside of your HTML that just was funky. I didn't like React. I didn't like JSX. I still don't like JSX. That's another story. But so I didn't do React, and React was more of a presentation, just the view portion, where other frameworks were like full-fledged frameworks, so you had to like combine React with something else. Ember was the other popular one. Ember to me felt more like Ruby on Rails. It was very opinionated. I think it was most people who did Ruby on Rails also used Ember, and it just never, like Ruby on Rails, it just never clicked with me. Like it just never, I didn't like it. So in the process of researching all these front-end frameworks for this new project at work, I came across a framework called Aurelia. I loved the syntax. And the story behind Aurelia was there was a guy, I'm trying to think of his name off the top of my head, who, Rob, oh, it'll come to me. Anyway, a guy who was on the Angular 2 core team, he didn't really like the direction they were taking things with all the weird syntax. They weren't HTML. They were going against HTML standards by adding some of these weird syntax. And so he ended up spinning off his own and created Aurelia. In the past, he'd created another framework called Durandal, which I wasn't familiar with. But when I tried out Aurelia, it seemed actually easier to migrate Angular JS to Aurelia than to Angular 2. So after sitting down with everyone in our company, on our team, and deciding which framework to go with, we ended up, as a group, choosing Aurelia. It wasn't unanimous, obviously. A lot of people were rooting for React or Ember. I think React had the second highest votes, just because it had become so popular by then. And even today, hindsight, probably would have been easier to go with React because that's where the community went. But still, to this day, I'd rather code in Aurelia than React. And I know it's an unpopular opinion. The community never really grew with Aurelia like I had hoped, but I still think it's a great framework. So that's kind of where the last 9 years of, well, I've been in the company 9 years, but probably the last 7 years or so, my experience is heavily with Aurelia. And we don't use Django in my current job, so I haven't really used it other than to maintain envelope budget. So that's a long history. Just trying to collect my thoughts here. So going forward, I wanted to talk about the tech stack that I decided to use for the rewrite of envelope budget. I've actually decided to go back to Django because there's a lot that I miss about Django. There's a lot of stuff that's just it just works. It's built in. The main parts of it are the ORM. I still prefer Django's ORM over SQL Alchemy or any other ORM I've used. The migration system. I think the built-in migrations with Django are better than any other I've seen. And then the Django admin, where you can manage your database with very little code. You can build out an interface to manage users, manage various model objects that you build in a really good way. I love how they built out the admin system, and I haven't really seen anything like it. As far as the API, I was going to use Fast API because I really like Fast API. I don't like Django REST framework. It always felt wonky to me and confusing the way they did it. But Fast API, I love how it's built. It's very simple. It's fast. But I found another project called Django Ninja, which kind of gives you the same type of syntax as Fast API, but it's more integrated with Django. It's just a plugin, so kind of get the best of both worlds. You get the automatic API documentation through the Swagger docs or Open API as it's called now. So that's kind of my decision on the back end. Also the authentication. Authentication just works in Django, and as I've used other auth systems, I've tried OAuth and Auth0, kind of authentication as a service. I think it's overkill for most things. It's great if you need something. Firebase has options if you need something free for a single page application. But Django is just, they've got libraries for OAuth that you can tie in. So if you want to sign in with Google or X.com or GitHub or whatever, you can tie those in pretty easily. So that's the reason I decided to go back to Django. As far as the front end, I'm still on the fence. I've been looking at various things. I don't think I want to do a single page application. I might, but because it's going to be open source, decided to open source it. I wanted it to be simple enough that people could get up and running quickly and contribute. And I think Django, just the old Django templates, would provide that simplicity rather than having another application where you've got to install all these packages and Webpack or whatever the latest build tools are just to transpile it, TypeScript. That's another one I'm on the fence with. I know that recently David Heinemeier Hansson came out and said he dislikes plain old JavaScript, which I've always kind of felt that way. And people railed on him. Like if I say that, people think I'm an idiot. If he says that, well, some people think he's an idiot, but I share a lot of unpopular opinions with DHH, even though he prefers Ruby on Rails and I prefer Django. But so I'm still kind of on the fence as far as what front end to use, and mainly CSS. I'm not a designer, so I'm trying to find a good template to use. Generally, I'll buy a template from ThemeForest to use, but because it's going to be open source, I want to find something with a good open source license that's okay with me using their code. So I'm looking at Flowbyte, which is built on top of Tailwind CSS. But again, while that's really popular right now, a lot of people love it. It feels weird to me to add so many different classes into inline classes and combine them like that. Bootstrap is probably the most popular option out there. Most people know it. So as far as going open source, It seems like Bootstrap's probably the way to go, but I'm trying to find a good starting point with the theme that uses Bootstrap 5. So stay tuned on that one. And as far as, since I'm not going to be using a single page app, I've got to figure out what to use for JavaScript libraries. I don't really want to use jQuery, is pretty much irrelevant because they've built all the tooling that you get from jQuery straight into the browser now. You can do all that without jQuery. But there's a library I recently found called Alpine.js, which um, it gives you kind of like the syntax that you're used to with a lot of single page apps, but it's a very small library and it just does some very basic functions that seem to be helpful. So that's one I'm looking at. It's probably using Alpine.js to augment whatever I do with Django templates just to simplify it. So that's kind of where I'm leaning right now with the tech stack. So kind of to bring it all together to review all that. This podcast is way longer than I thought it would be. But hopefully it's been beneficial to whoever's listening. But so to kind of bring it all back together, Django on the back end with, and I'll probably use SQLite since that'll be the easiest for open source. People can set it up really easy with SQLite. If you're going to host it yourself, just use SQLite. But for me, hosting it, for those who don't want to self-host or work on the application, I'll probably use Postgres because that kind of works the best with Django. So Django or Postgres or SQLite for the database. For the API, I'll use Django Ninja. For the front end, I'll use Bootstrap for CSS. I'll use Alpine.js for JavaScript, and then try to find a good open source library to kind of get me started on the templating with the CSS and Bootstrap 5. So still some decisions to make. I'm still trying out some things. I may switch to Flowbyte. I've done a project in Flowbyte, and I like the look and feel of it. But yeah, still, jury's still out there, so we'll see. But yeah, that's, like I said, a long rant on the technology. Hopefully it all made sense. If you have any questions, let me know. And I will talk to you again soon. Thanks.